Fort Sumter, South Carolina, April, 1861, under the Confederate flag. The first shots of the Civil War took place here on April 12, 1861, as Confederate batteries opened fire on the Union fort, bombarding it for 34 straight hours. On April 13, Union forces surrendered and evacuated the fort. Union forces made many attempts to retake the fort throughout the war, but only took possession on February 22, 1865, after Confederate forces had evacuated Charleston. The routines of camp life of the 31st Pennsylvania Infantry, later 82d Pennsylvania Infantry, at Queen's Farm, vicinity of Fort Slocum, Washington, District of Columbia during the Civil War in 1861. Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, in a head and shoulders portrait taken by photographer Alexander Gardner on February 5, 1865. Traditionally called, "Last Photograph of Lincoln from Life," this final photo in Lincoln's last photo session was long thought to have been made on April 10, 1865, but more recent research has indicated the earlier date in February. The crack comes from the original negative, which was broken and discarded back in 1865. The entirety of the American Civil War took place while Lincoln was in office, starting a month after he was elected and ending just days before his assassination in April of 1865. Yorktown, Virginia, embarkation for White House Landing, Virginia. Photograph from the main Eastern Theater of War, the Peninsular Campaign, May–August 1862. Fortifications at Yorktown, Virginia during the Peninsula Campaign of 1862. Jefferson Davis, a former United States Secretary of War and Senator from the state of Mississippi, served as the President of the Confederate States of America from 1861 to 1865. After the war, he was captured, indicted for treason, and imprisoned for 2 years, after which he was freed on bail. His case was eventually dropped in 1869 and he lived another 20 years, passing away at the age of 81. Federal cavalry at Sudley Ford, Virginia following the Battle of First Bull Run in March of 1862. This September 1862 photo provided by the Library of Congress shows Allan Pinkerton on horseback during the Battle of Antietam, near Sharpsburg, Maryland. Before the outbreak of war, he had founded the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. In 1861, he famously foiled an alleged plot to assassinate President-elect Lincoln, and later served as the head of the Union Intelligence Service, the forerunner of the U.S. Secret Service. Pictured are 13-inch Seacoast mortars of Federal Battery No. 4 with officers of 1st Connecticut Heavy Artillery, near Yorktown, Virginia in May of 1862. The 150th Pennsylvania Infantry Camp on Belle Plaine, Virginia is pictured in March 1862, 3 weeks before the Battle of Chancellorsville. Union forces of Benson's Battery in the Battle of Seven Pines stand guard in the fighting against General Thomas Stonewall Jackson's Confederate troops at Fair Oaks, near Richmond, Virginia. The battle, also called Fair Oaks, took place on May 31 and June 1, 1862. The Federal ironclad Galena, after recent action with Confederate batteries at Drury's Bluff, on Virginia's James River, circa 1862. Pictured is a lone grave at the base of the tree. Photographed near Antietam, Maryland in September of 1862. Slaves prepare cotton for a cotton gin on Smith's Plantation, Port Royal Island, South Carolina, in 1862. Inflation of the Intrepid. This was a hydrogen gas balloon used by the Union Army Balloon Corps for aerial reconnaissance. The Balloon Corps operated a total of 7 balloons, with the Intrepid being favored by Chief Aeronaut Thaddeus Lowe. A Federal encampment on the Pamunkey River, Cumberland Landing, Virginia in May of 1862. Fugitive slaves fording the Rappahannock River, Virginia during Union General John Pope's retreat in August of 1862. A Civil War ambulance crew in 1862 removing the wounded from a battlefield. It shows a horse-drawn ambulance, and the Zouave uniforms of this unit. Union General Isaac I Stevens, seated on a porch in March of 1862, near Beaufort, South Carolina. General Stevens, formerly the first governor of Washington Territory, was killed in action at the Battle of Chantilly on September 1, 1862 after picking up the fallen regimental colors of his old regiment, shouting, "Highlanders, my Highlanders, follow your general." Charging with his troops while carrying the banner of St. Andrew's Cross, Stevens was struck in the temple by a bullet and died instantly. White House Landing, on the Pamunkey River, Virginia. The site was a major Union Army supply base in 1862 during the Peninsula Campaign. The deck and turret of the ironclad USS Monitor on the James River, Virginia on July 9, 1862. The Monitor was the first ironclad warship commissioned by the U.S. Navy, and famously fought the Confederate ironclad CSS Virginia in the Battle of Hampton Roads. The first meeting in combat of ironclad warships was on March 8 and March 9, 1862. Bodies of soldiers lie on the ground in front of Dunker Church, after the Battle of Antietam, Maryland in September of 1862. Stacked cannonballs, possibly a view of an arsenal yard in Washington, District of Columbia. A March, 1863 photo of the USS Essex. The 1,000-ton ironclad river gunboat, originally a steam-powered ferry, was acquired during the American Civil War by the U.S. Army in 1861 for the Western Gunboat Flotilla. She was transferred to the U.S. Navy in 1862 and participated in several operations on the Mississippi River, including the capture of Baton Rouge and Port Hudson in 1863. Pictured are rebel prisoners waiting at Belle Plaine, Virginia for transportation. A view of Washington, District of Columbia, from the intersection of 3rd and Indiana Avenue, circa 1863. In the foreground is Trinity Episcopal Church and in the background is the unfinished Capitol building. Construction on the Capitol was briefly suspended early in the war, but continued through the later years. Morris Island, South Carolina. The shattered muzzle of a 300-pounder Parrott rifle after it had burst, photographed in July or August of 1863. A view of Andersonville Prison, Georgia. Andersonville was an infamous Confederate prisoner of war camp, where nearly 13,000 of its approximately 45,000 Union prisoners died in brutal conditions suffering from starvation, disease, and abuse from their captors. Dead horses surround the damaged Trossel House, results of the Battle of Gettysburg, in July of 1863. Union Major General Daniel Sickles used the farmhouse as a headquarters, while Union and Confederate troops fought among the farm buildings during the fierce battle. Pictured are Union officers of the 69th Infantry New York at Fort Corcoran, Virginia with Colonel Michael Corcoran. A Harvest of Death, a famous scene from the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in July of 1863. Confederate soldiers lie dead among rifles and other gear, behind a stone wall at the foot of Marye's Heights near Fredericksburg, Virginia on May 3, 1863. Union forces penetrated the Confederate lines at this point, during the Second Battle of Fredericksburg. President Lincoln on the battlefield in Antietam, Maryland, October 1862. Serving as a soldier in uniform and getting regular Army pay, a former slave, Center, with hands in pockets, stands with other Federal soldiers at the Army of the Potomac Winter Headquarters near Fredericksburg, Virginia. The log hut served as a mess house for the regiment. Confederate soldiers on the march through enemy-occupied Frederick, Maryland in 1862. Confederate soldiers lie dead near a fence on the Hagerstown Road, after the Battle of Antietam, Maryland in September of 1862. Union General Ulysses S. Grant served as commanding general of the Union Army during the Civil War. After the war, his popularity in the North helped him to win the U.S. presidency in 1868, and again in 1872. President Abraham Lincoln, standing in the center without a hat, is surrounded by a crowd during his famous Gettysburg Address in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania on November 19, 1863. Confederate General Robert E. Lee poses in a late April 1865 portrait taken by Matthew Brady in Richmond, Virginia. By the end of the war, Lee had been appointed as General-in-Chief of all Confederate forces, having led numerous armies into battle against Union forces during the conflict. It was Lee's surrender to General Ulysses Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865 that signaled the end of the war. Two different photographs of Peter, a slave from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, ca. 1863. The scars are a result of a whipping by his overseer Artayu Carrier, who was subsequently fired by the master. It took 2 months to recover from the beating. These photographs were widely distributed in the North during the war. Also called Gordon, Peter later enlisted in the Union Army. Rose O'Neal Greenhow, Wild Rose, poses with her daughter inside the old Capitol Prison in Washington, District of Columbia. Greenhow, a Confederate spy, used her social ties in the Washington area to help her pass information to the South. She was apprehended by Allan Pinkerton in 1861, and held for nearly a year. She was released, deported to Richmond, Virginia, and welcomed heartily by Southerners. She served as a diplomat for the Confederacy, traveling to Europe and profiting from a popular memoir she wrote in London in 1863. In October of 1864, she was sailing home aboard a blockade runner pursued by a Union ship near North Carolina. Her ship ran aground and Greenhow drowned during an escape attempt after her rowboat capsized. A scene in Alexandria, Virginia, in August of 1863. The storefront of 283 Duke Street reads, "Price, Birch Company, Dealers in Slaves." William Mahone was a civil engineer, railroad executive, and ardent supporter of the secession of the South. In 1861, after Virginia seceded, Mahone, still a civilian, orchestrated the capture of the Gosport shipyard in Portsmouth, Virginia by driving an empty passenger train loudly into town while bluffing the Federal troops into abandoning the shipyard. He later took a commission as a colonel in the Confederate Army. After the war, Mahone served a term as the U.S. Senator from Virginia in 1881. Pictured in Cumberland Landing, Virginia on May 14, 1862, is a group of contrabands. This was a term used to describe freed or escaped slaves. This is a rebel fortifications near Atlanta, Georgia in 1863 or 1864. General William Tecumseh Sherman, a graduate of the United States Military Academy at West Point, served in the Union Army commanding several campaigns. Perhaps best known was his capture of Atlanta, Georgia, after which his troops began Sherman's March to the Sea, inflicting massive damage to military and civilian infrastructure during a month-long march toward the coast, ending with the capture of Savannah, Georgia. Wounded soldiers at rest near Marye's Heights, Fredericksburg, Virginia after the Battle of Spotsylvania, in 1864. A soldier's body lies mangled on a field, killed by a shell at the Battle of Gettysburg. Pictured as Frederick Douglass, circa 1879. Born a slave in Maryland, Douglass escaped as a young man, eventually becoming an influential social reformer, a powerful orator and a leader of the abolitionist movement. Confederate troops viewed from a distance of 1 mile on the opposite side of a destroyed bridge in Fredericksburg, Virginia by Union photographer Matthew Brady. Nurse Ann Bell tending to wounded soldiers in a Union hospital circa 1863. Pictured as Robert Smalls, who was born a slave in South Carolina. During the Civil War, Smalls steered the CSS Planter, an armed Confederate military transport. On May 12, 1862, the Planter's 3 white officers decided to spend the night ashore. About 3 a.m., Smalls and 7 of the 8 enslaved crewmen decided to make a run for the Union vessels that formed the blockade, as they had earlier planned. Smalls dressed in the captain's uniform and had a straw hat similar to that of the white captain. The Planter stopped at a nearby wharf to pick up Smalls' family and the relatives of other crewmen. Then they sailed toward Union lines, with a white sheet as a flag. After the war, he went on to serve in the United States House of Representatives, representing South Carolina. Soldiers of the 6th Corps, Army of the Potomac, in trenches before storming Marye's Heights at the Second Battle of Fredericksburg during the Chancellorsville Campaign, Virginia, May 1863. This photograph is sometimes labeled as taken at the 1864 Siege of Petersburg, Virginia. Interior of a hospital ward at Washington, D.C.'s Harewood General Hospital in 1864. Harewood General Hospital opened in September 1862 and closed in May 1866, after the end of the war. Confederate General Stonewall Jackson was considered a shrewd tactician. Jackson served in several campaigns, but during the Battle of Chancellorsville he was accidentally shot by his own troops, losing an arm to amputation. He died of complications of pneumonia 8 days later, quickly becoming celebrated as a hero in the South. Harriet Tubman in a photograph dating from circa 1860. Tubman was born into slavery, but escaped to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in 1849, and provided valuable intelligence to Union forces during the Civil War. Pictured as Sergeant James H. Harris. A Marylander and member of Company B, 38th 5th U.S. Colored Troops. Harris was one of 23 black Union soldiers who served with such distinction during the Civil War that he received the Medal of Honor. This is a portrait of Brigadier General Robert Houston Milroy, officer of the Union Army. Milroy most noted for his defeat at the Second Battle of Winchester in 1863. He later became Superintendent of Indian Affairs in the Washington Territory. Milroy died in Olympia, Washington in 1890, at the age of 73. This is John Henry, a servant, at the headquarters of the 3rd Army Corps, Army of the Potomac in October of 1863. This is John L. Burns, known as the "Old Hero of Gettysburg," with gun and crutches, in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1863. During the Battle of Gettysburg, Burns, a 70-year-old civilian living nearby, grabbed his flintlock musket and powder horn and walked out to the battlefield to join in with Union troops. The soldiers took him in and Burns served well as a sharpshooter. During a withdrawal, Burns was wounded several times and left on the field. He managed to get himself to safety where his wounds were treated, and his story elevated him to the status of national hero briefly. Pictured is Confederate General J.D. Marmaduke in his uniform. Lord William Abinger and a group of officers at the Army of the Potomac headquarters, near Falmouth, Virginia in April of 1863. Photographer Timothy H. O'Sullivan took this photo one half of a stereo view of Alfred R. Wadd, artist of Harper's Weekly, while he sketched on the battlefield near Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in July of 1863. General George Armstrong Custer, a United States Army officer and cavalry commander in the American Civil War and the Indian Wars. Custer built a strong reputation during the Civil War, and afterwards he was sent west to fight in the Indian Wars. Custer was later defeated and killed at the famous Battle of the Little Bighorn in eastern Montana Territory in 1876. Mail wagon for headquarters, Army of the Potomac, at Falmouth, Virginia in March 1863. Pictured as a soldier enduring an amputation in a field hospital in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This photograph shows 3 Johnny Reb prisoners captured at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in 1863. A mortar mounted on a railroad car near Petersburg, Virginia. This was the area called the Slaughter Pen. It was located at the foot of Round Top. The photo was taken after the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in July of 1863. Close-up of the camp of the Tennessee Colored Battery, pictured during the Siege of Vicksburg at Johnsonville, Tennessee in 1864. Bodies of Confederate soldiers next to Mrs. Alsop's house, near Spotsylvania Courthouse, Virginia in May of 1864. The CSS Stonewall was a 1,390-ton ironclad built in Bordeaux, France for the Confederate Navy in 1864. After she crossed the Atlantic, reaching Havana, Cuba, it was already May, 1865 and the war had ended. Spanish authorities took possession, soon handing it over to the U.S. government. Council of War. General Ulysses S. Grant, second from left on bench at center left. General George G. Meade, Assistant Secretary of War Charles A. Dana, and numerous staff officers meet at Massaponax Church in Virginia on May 21, 1864. These are General Sherman's men destroying the railroad before the evacuation of Atlanta, Georgia in 1864. A captured Confederate encampment near Petersburg, Virginia in June of 1864. The ruins of an extensively damaged roundhouse in Atlanta, Georgia after the Atlanta Campaign in the summer of 1864. After Union Major General William T. Sherman captured the city, he began his destructive march to the sea, finally taking the port of Savannah on December 21, 1864. A picket station of colored troops near Dutch Gap Canal, Dutch Gap, Virginia in November of 1864. In Atlanta, Georgia, soldiers sit atop boxcars at a railroad depot. At right is the office of Atlanta's Daily Intelligencer newspaper. Panorama made from 2 photographs taken by George N. Barnard in 1864. A group of men from Company B, U.S. Engineer Battalion near Petersburg, Virginia in August of 1864. A black Union soldier sits posted in front of a slave auction house on Whitehall Street in Atlanta, Georgia in 1864. The sign reads, "Auction Negro Sales." A party of the 50th New York Engineers builds a road on the south bank of the North Anna River near Jericho Mills, Virginia on May 24, 1864. Union prisoners draw their rations in this view from main gate of Andersonville Prison, Andersonville, Georgia on August 17, 1864. A pontoon bridge near Petersburg, Virginia in April of 1865. Petersburg, Virginia, the first Federal Army wagon train entering the town in April of 1865. Guards examine passes near Georgetown, Washington District of Columbia, on the banks of the Potomac River during the Civil War in 1865. A view of the burned district of Richmond, Virginia and the Capitol across the Canal Basin in 1865. The city was assaulted by Union forces for more than 9 months during the Siege of Petersburg, after which Confederate General Robert E. Lee's army abandoned the battered city in April, 1865. Stage actor and Confederate sympathizer John Wilkes Booth, in a portrait taken some time before he assassinated President Abraham Lincoln in 1865. Booth and a group of co-conspirators planned to kill Lincoln, Vice President Andrew Johnson, and Secretary of State William Seward, hoping to assist the Confederacy despite the earlier surrender of Robert E. Lee. After he shot Lincoln at Ford's Theater in Washington, District of Columbia, on April 14, 1865, he fled to a farm in rural northern Virginia but was tracked down 12 days later and killed by a Union soldier. Conspirator Lewis Powell Payne in a sweater, seated and manacled in the Washington Navy Yard, Washington, D.C. in April of 1865. Powell attempted unsuccessfully to assassinate United States Secretary of State William H. Seward in his home on April 14, 1865. Powell was soon caught, and became one of 4 people hanged for the Lincoln assassination conspiracy. A group of contrabands at Hacksaw's Mill, Richmond, Virginia on June 9, 1865. The hanging hooded bodies of the 4 conspirators, Mary Surratt, Lewis Powell Payne, David Harold, and George Atzerodt, executed on July 7, 1865 at Fort McNair in Washington, District of Columbia. All 4 had been convicted of taking part in the conspiracy to assassinate Abraham Lincoln. A nearly starved Union soldier who survived imprisonment in the notorious Confederate prison in Andersonville, Georgia. Residents walk through the ruins of Richmond, Virginia in April of 1865. Richmond served as the capital of the Confederate States of America during the majority of the Civil War. After a long siege in 1865, with General Ulysses S. Grant's Union troops about to take the city, Confederate troops were ordered to evacuate, destroying bridges and burning supplies they could not carry. A massive fire swept through Richmond, destroying large parts of the city. About 1 week after the evacuation of Richmond, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses Grant near Appomattox, Virginia on April 9, 1865. Grounds of the destroyed arsenal with scattered shot and shell in Richmond, Virginia 1865. A view of Columbia, South Carolina seen from the Capitol following the occupation of the Union Army in 1865, during which much of the city was destroyed. Collecting the remains of soldiers killed in battle near Cold Harbor, Virginia in April of 1865. An execution in Washington, District of Columbia on November 10, 1865. Henry Wirtz, former commander of the Confederate prisoner of war camp near Andersonville, Georgia, was tried and hung after the war for conspiracy and murder related to his command of the notorious camp. Hello, and thank you for watching my rendition of the Civil War. My name is David Robertson and I grew up in Akron, Ohio. I created this video to not only highlight the brave men who participated in this war, but to also talk about 2 men who fought on different sides of this conflict. Those 2 men were my paternal second great-grandfathers. Here is a short story about my relationship to these men and the fate they suffered due to the Civil War. My father, Thomas Joseph Robertson, was born the 23rd of May 1928. One of 3 children, he was the son of Joseph Orr Robertson and Elizabeth Saloma Delong. This is my paternal grandmother, Elizabeth Saloma Delong. An only child, Elizabeth was born the 14th of October 1901 in Parkersburg, West Virginia. She was the daughter of Joseph Patrick Delong and Josephine Findler. This is Joseph Patrick Delong. Joseph was my paternal great-grandfather and was born the 7th of May 1874 in Belmont County, Ohio. One of 5 children, Joseph was the only son of Owen D. Delong and Matilda Sarah McConaughey. This is Owen Delong. Owen was my second paternal great-grandfather who fought for the Union Army. Owen was born the 13th of September 1844 in Belmont County, Ohio and died the 27th of March 1880. He was the son of John Francis DeLong and Julia Ann Turner. On the 27th of February 1864, Owen joined the Volunteer Union Army of the 60th Ohio Infantry Company D. In Owen's first conflict on 9 May 1864, he was wounded while fighting at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in Spotsylvania, Virginia. After recovering from his injury, Owen participated in 10 additional battles. On 28 July 1865, Owen was mustered out of the Union Army due to his injuries. According to Civil War pension records, Owen was badly affected by his wound. Due to his injury at the Battle of Spotsylvania, Owen developed a skin condition called purpura. Apparently, it became so painful that he became mentally unbalanced. In a moment of non-comprehension, he hung himself. He died March 27, 1880 in Ohio and was buried in St. Mary's Cemetery, which is 2 miles west of Temperanceville, Ohio. This is my paternal grandfather, Joseph Orr Robertson. Joseph was born on the 11th of August 1897 in Lawrence County, Ohio. Joseph was one of 7 children born to Thomas Narcissus Robertson and Margaret Reed. Thomas Narcissus Robertson was my paternal great-grandfather. Thomas was born on the 15th of December 1863 in Grayson County, Virginia. Thomas was one of 5 children born to Thomas Rice Robertson and Amy Kite. Born the 10th of June 1826 in Wythe County, Virginia, Thomas Rice Robertson was one of 12 children born to John S. Robertson and Sarah Baber. Thomas, who is my second paternal great-grandfather, enlisted in the Confederate Army on 29 May 1861. In Wythe County, Virginia. Having joined the 45th Virginia Infantry, Company D as a shoemaker, he participated in several battles before finding himself in the middle of the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain. On Monday the 9th day of May 1864, the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain commenced. Located in the heart of Pulaski County, Virginia, the Union Army outnumbered the Confederate Army, 3-1. 15 regiments from the Union Army descended upon Cloyd's Mountain, where 10 regiments of the Confederate Army were positioned. At approximately 11 a.m., the conflict began. After the battle had ended, 688 men from the Union Army had lost their lives, as well as 538 men from the Confederate Army. Unfortunately, Thomas Rice Robertson was one of the 538 men from the Confederate Army, who lost their lives during the battle. According to a report published on 14 May 1864, the Stanton Spectator newspaper reported that the 45th Regiment is said to have behaved with conspicuous valor and that the soldiers that died were buried on the battlefield. This is where we believe the remains of Thomas Rice Robertson are buried. Although both of my second great-grandfathers fought for different reasons during the Civil War, both of their lives, as well as their families' lives, changed forever on May 9, 1864. Separated by approximately 225 miles in 2 different counties of Virginia, both suffered injuries that would ultimately take both of their lives. Owen D. DeLong, who fought for the Union Army, endured 16 years of pain and suffering from the injury he sustained during the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse, before hanging himself in the barn of his home. Thomas Rice Robertson, who was a simple shoemaker in the Confederate Army, was fatally wounded at the Battle of Cloyd's Mountain and died on the battlefield. Thank you again for watching my rendition of the American Civil War and the war between my 2 families.